got a good crew and audience here, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. Just welcome everyone. I want to thank you for joining us today for our LPK Digital Roundtable around the topic of evolving your heritage brand. We're really excited to jump in, but of course, there's some housekeeping as always to take care of. Just to let everyone know, we are recording this event, and we will be sharing it with you via email afterwards as a follow-up, so that's great. We will also plan about 10 minutes towards the end of our conversation for any sort of Q&A. So please do take advantage of the chat. Please put any observations, any questions you might have, and my colleagues will keep a watch on that, and we'll organize a bit of Q&A towards the end. And also just a fun legal disclaimer, as always, that if we do have any images that we put on screen throughout, these are only for educational purposes, and the rights remain with the owner. So it's likely that if you've dialed in, you know who we are at LPK to some degree. But if not, just to say that LPK is a consultancy specializing in branding, innovation, and customer experience. We work across a diverse range of categories, and we really like to partner with businesses to create brands that are both timely and obviously what we're here to talk about today, timeless. So that is the topic of the day. So just to introduce myself, my name is Amy Steinmetz. I'm the Managing Director for LPK Europe. Don't let the Kentucky accent fool you, but I am sitting in North London, where I'm based most of the time. And I'm really excited to be the facilitator and host of today's discussion. And as you know, we're here to talk about heritage brands, and we've got a great panel of experts and colleagues of mine to help join in that conversation. So let's meet them. The first from our LPK team is Michael Wintraub. Michael is our Chief Strategy Officer based in LPK North America. We also have Susan Arnold. Susan is a brand director, also based in our North America offices. And we have some great, amazing guests with us today. First, we have Kara Buckler. Kara is a Senior Director of Creative at the J.M. Smucker Company. And that company houses a multitude of brands across many categories, such as jams, coffee, and pet food. We also have Grania Saunders. Grania is the Global Marketing Manager working at William Grant & Sons, and she looks after Glenfiddich, joining us today from Dublin. And last but not least, we have Bryony McComb. Bryony is Associate Marketing Director at Mondelez based in Switzerland, and she looks after the confectionery category, working on some of the world's most loved chocolate brands, and a very exciting job. So we thought we'd start today with the panel by asking maybe a more personal than professional question to sort of kickstart things, which is, what is a heritage brand that you love personally, but you maybe have never worked on, and why do you love that brand? I think I'll ask Kara to start, if you don't mind.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me. First of all, it's great to be here, and I love the Cadbury brand, and I'm not just saying that because Bryony and Amy work on that business. Genuinely, I think it's got an amazing history, and it's one of those iconic brands that you can take away the name and you still know what it is. And I think it would just be a joy to work in confections. So there you have it.
Thanks, Kara. Bryony, how about you?
I love the Cadbury brand as well, and I must say it's a joy to be able to work on chocolate brands, but there are also some amazing other brands. Difficult to choose because I think there's quite a few different things that appeal to me from different brands, but I think Lego is incredible. Just their creativity and their purpose is amazing, and then L'Oreal is another one because they have incredible innovation, and their purpose also speaks to me. So I think those two would be the two big ones for me.
Thanks, Bryony. Grania, how about you?
Hello, everyone. For me, as much as I do love chocolate, the one for me is actually Gucci. And it's simply because it's the highs and the lows of the brand. I mean, the brand has gone from rock bottom all the way back to the top, and the story's so interesting. And they've, especially of late, they've just been so brave, and they're trying so many new things. And I suppose, like, I think it might be sort of a marketing person's dream to be able to put Harry Styles in a dressing gown in a chip shop with a chicken in an ad. I think it's so bizarre and crazy, and it's so interesting, and it's sort of reflective of everything that's going on. So for me, yes, it's Gucci, and hopefully someday I can afford to buy some.
Great. Thanks, Grania. Susan, how about you? Did you have one you'd like to add?
You know, for me, a brand that I've never had the chance to work on, but I think would be super fun, is Crayola. I have really always appreciated that brand, and how fun to get to work in a category that is so squarely directed at, you know, almost entirely at point of market entry, with young ones. And so, and just the amount of creativity and fun that brand exudes. For those of you who are Enneagram fans, I'm a 7 on the Enneagram. And so that just meets up very nicely with kind of just who I am as a person. So, but yeah, Crayola definitely for me.
Yeah, and also a product that people debate on how to properly say. Is it a crayon? Is it a crown? We will never know.
You'll never know.
Michael, how about you?
Yeah, a brand that I think about that has incredibly rich history, but somehow seems to always kind of maintain its modern day relevance is Converse. So, you know, stories, tons of texture and stories that go back years with, you know, Jackson Pollock or Kurt Cobain. And, you know, anytime, I think particularly with fashion brands, it's like, are we just aging with our consumers? And I think Converse has been able to remain relevant to young people. I even had the experience a year or two ago. You know, I live in suburban, Midwestern United States. So not exactly the cutting edge of fashion or self-expression, but driving through our suburb and looking over and seeing kind of two like disaffected, alienated teens who were kind of eager to express how different they were. And I looked down and, you know, they're each wearing Chuck Taylors. And so you're like, all right, the brand is still strong.
Love it. Yeah. So I think I thought that was a really interesting opening question, because we started having this discussion. We were all sort of debating, what is a heritage brand? How do you define one? You know, is it only about time? So when you were sort of looking at these brands or thinking about which brands to choose, maybe I'll start with you, Bryony. How did you think about, what do you think a heritage brand is? How would you define that?
It's definitely about time. I think, you know, it's a brand that has stood the test of time, but I think it's also around continuity of purpose, around what you stand for, and then the ability to adjust that over time. So you're staying relevant, but still, you know, if I look at the roots of Cadbury, you know, over 100 years ago, they're very similar to what they stand for today. So I think for me, that's really important, that you can see that continuity and that consistency. So that is what will help make a brand, you know, continue to grow over the years.
Yeah. Grania, would you agree with that, or do you have a different perspective?
Well, I absolutely agree with it. But interestingly, I also think there's a sense you've got to look forward as well. So for me, it's this idea of a brand that will exist in 100 years' time as well. Because, you know, some brands are only designed to be here for now. They are of the moment. But actually, the idea that it is a brand that whatever you're doing now, somebody will be looking back at. And will that will what you do today stand the test of time, and people expect it to be around? So I think that sort of sense of endurance.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Kara, anything to add from your perspective?
That was well said by both, but I would agree. And if you think about the time factor of just withstanding economic downturns, wars, trends, and fads, it's being able to live through that. And I thought Michael's Converse example is a great one. It's the ability to stay relevant through, in some cases, over centuries.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And hopefully as we go through the conversation today, we'll uncover sort of how do you do that? So, you know, a lot of us work on brands that have been around for decades and, you know, have been passed down from generation to generation, and we're merely looking after them, right, for a moment in time. So how do we do the due diligence and make sure that we're being responsible and protecting all those layers and stories that you're mentioning? You know, from a consumer perspective, obviously, if you're a brand that's been around for, I guess, anywhere for over 10 years, maybe, there's probably a different level of consumer expectation that is grounded in a heritage brand versus a new breakthrough, new to the world brand. Does anyone have any perspectives on what some of those expectations are that are maybe a bit different? Grania, any thoughts from you on that, maybe?
Well, I think the sort of it's part of being a heritage brand. So people have expectations, so they have clear views on what you stand for. Whereas, you know, if you come into a space sort of new, you have much more license and much more freedom, because you know you're not you know, there's no risk of breaking that trust. You're sort of starting it all up. So people sort of, they give you a lot of leeway, but as a sort of as a brand that people, you know, they have history with, and they value that. You know, the if you get it wrong, you know, the you know, there's much more to lose with each and every one of your consumers. That risk that comes in, so you know, your mistakes are bigger.
Yeah, and more people to see, in theory.
Exactly.
Yeah, so I mean, Brian, you're working on Cadbury, as you mentioned. Obviously, a lot of you know, in confection, people love their chocolate. What do you find when you talk about change or talk about newness with consumers? How does that go?
I think in chocolate specifically, people love, NPD. So they get really excited about what's coming next. So luckily, as a category, innovation is really welcomed. But, at the end of the day, you have to just deliver. And if you're not delivering something that is tasty, amazing, a specifically new experience, then I think, people can feel a little bit let down. So it's really about making sure, are we actually answering that brief and that need? And I think it also very much depends when you compare to a startup, what stage the startup is at. So if you are at really early stage, like a Kickstarter, I think you have a lot more freedom because people are really, open to trying new things and they want to be with you on the innovation journey. Whereas if you're a little bit more established or traditional, I think then you have to really deliver on the quality, because if you don't, then the repeats becomes an issue and you may lose people.
Yeah, it is that risk factor, right? Is a bit higher. And even within an organization, I think I've spoken to a few of you guys about how does innovation get through these different organizations, and sometimes there's really high expectations in terms of volume and making sure that it's a big idea. You wouldn't maybe have those same expectations with a smaller or a startup company because you have less to lose. You're investing less. Kara, from your perspective, maybe from a design perspective, from a consumer reaction, certainly I'm sure some stories there working on some of the great brands that you've worked on.
I agree that the bar is set high, that credibility that's been built over so many years. What's surprising sometimes is that when you talk to consumers, you actually at times have more permission to evolve than what we, even as sort of brand stewards or brand owners, feel that we do. I will say though, for, billion-dollar brands that are iconic and have so much heritage, it can feel like shifting, steering a giant cruise ship, like trying to evolve it in a way that is meaningful and that keeps the integrity of what that brand is all about, but to stay relevant. It's a tough balance. Agree that the beauty of having a newer brand is like the sky's the limit in many ways. You have more constraints with a heritage brand, but that's also part of the joy of it and part of the fun of it, that you're working within very established brand codes. If you're a Mark Ritson fan, there's these things that heritage brands have that startups would love to have from an equity standpoint.
Absolutely. And do you think there's any categories that benefit or have, I guess, maybe a disadvantage of being a heritage brand versus an advantage? So, is a heritage brand in fintech or in, I don't know, ice cream? How does a category play a role, or do you think that the rules of the game are the same no matter the category? Michael, do you have a perspective on that, maybe?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think on both sides, like there are, technology, kind of emerging markets, emerging technologies. I do think lend themselves to newer brands where nobody has heritage. It's, and if you're an existing brand and you're trying to kind of stretch into a new place and you're kind of anchored with existing equity in the minds of consumers, it just takes kind of more investment probably to kind of move the associations. It's basically a bigger cognitive load for the consumer. So if something pops up the technology is new, the brand is new. That's easy to wrap your head around. If I'm stretching from something existing, I mean, if you think about like what's happened in the world of finance, and if you're, you know, oh gosh, like, you know, Raymond James or something that's, you know, has like an older equity and you're trying to show up in Bitcoin, well, that's going to take a lot of work to convince consumers that Fidelity or something like that is relevant in Bitcoin versus if you're, you know, Coinbase or something. Flip side is we can think about, you know, things like apparel, like jewelry, like watches, where spirits certainly, where heritage and provenance and story tend to play a really big role, and that can be a huge advantage. I'm sure Grania has, you know, some great examples of how they are really thoughtful about leveraging that and romancing that. So is it impossible for, you know, upstarts to succeed in those categories? Like, we know there's ones that do it in spirits or in fashion, and likewise we know there's heritage brands that can make the leap, but I think it requires more work. The odds are longer. You know, you have to be probably more thoughtful and intentional, and probably basically spend more in order to win in those spaces.
Yeah. I was going to come to Grania next, because I imagine, you know, I worked in whiskey for a bit as well, and whiskey actually literally takes time to age. Like, you can't just like launch a whiskey out of nowhere. So how is it for an industry where, you know, there's this idea of heritage and brands and tradition versus a new entrant that comes into the market? What's that been like for you?
Joe, it's really interesting because like the soonest we can get at our product on Benfitic is 12 years. It takes 12 years to age the liquid. So, you know, we plan off a 50-year cycle on our whiskey. So it's very different. However, that said, you know, there's all these rules of the category, and this, you know, it gives you a very strict setup. But it's still about delivering what consumers need and not being scared to actually set yourself up as a brand that's willing to take those risks and do different things. So while we're sort of very much a traditional, we make whiskey in a certain way, we're always looking at, well, what can we do differently? How can we do it differently? What does that mean in terms of, like, you know, how we sell our whiskey, how we make our whiskey? We sort of, there's a real sense within quite a traditional industry. It's about how do you keep what actually adds value, and that, you know, that sort of generates something useful, versus just, well, that's the way we've always done it, that's the way we do it. Because, you know, when I actually spoke to our master blender about this, and he was like, Brynja, I'm looking at every single new possible way there is to make whiskey. You know, the sort of looking at technology that ages whiskey without actually aging it for 20 years. That doesn't mean we'll actually ever do it, but he is absolutely up to date, knows everything about it and what can be done, and has a whole world of experiments in the distillery. Now, some of them break the rules, some of them might never get launched, but this idea that sort of, you know, there's always almost like a Willy Wonka center of things that you can do, and then some of those come out and we launch them, and we, you know, we play with them. And so it's about kind of going, there may be strict rules and parameters, but actually sometimes they free you, because, you know, instead of having a total blue sky, you have a certain space and you really have to apply creativity to it.
Yeah. And I think for so long, whiskey, you know, we thought it was only these brands that had been around for 50, 60, 100 years. And then in the Irish world, so Roe and Co. and Teeling and all these new brands that have popped up over the last decade, they've proven that you can come in and do something new.
Completely. And it's not just about, you know, the liquid itself, it's about how you serve it, where you drink it, the occasions. And, you know, there's a world of spaces that you can go to. It's not about, I suppose it's about never not thinking just about what you've always done and the way you've always done it.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of when we are thinking about new ways, obviously we were speaking about sort of protecting those things that you need to hold true. Can you talk a little bit, maybe Kara, about how does that work in your world of design in terms of distinctive assets or equities, and how do you make sure that you're evaluating them properly, protecting them, or when do you know it's time to move on or not move on?
gosh, that's a lot to unpack. You know, I think I could maybe even share a internal sort of case study around brand codes that didn't go well. And this is years ago when we owned the Hungry Jack brand. And for those in the United States, you probably know it's syrups and pancakes. And we had this squatty, kind of not necessarily attractive syrup bottle that you could put in the microwave. And it, you know, that shape was rather distinctive. For myriad business reasons, moved away from that to a more sort of sleek, slender bottle, more in line with the category. Consumers swiftly rejected that, and we reverted back. And I mean, the obvious lesson was, and not just for Hungry Jack, but I think for any business, it might look good on paper, like, you know, we need to modernize, you know, better margins, better operational efficiency, but at the expense of something that is so distinctive about your brand, that is honestly detrimental. You can never sacrifice those codes and those things you own. So it's a delicate balance, and I think it's the thing that creates a lot of rigor around any type of redesign we're going through on a heritage brand. But it's that care and consideration that is so critical to making sure how we show up is not, you know, it's not so disruptive to those loyal consumers that they're turning away from your brand. So
yeah, I mean, half the battle of a design brief is defining the objective and level of change, isn't it? It's the freedom of a tight brief, we say. I mean, Bryony, in your world, there's obviously there's all these equities in the chocolate brands you work on, but there's also intangible equity, that taste, right? That sort of mouthfeel. And how do you talk about that in terms of retaining the credibility of that and making sure when you innovate, you're thinking still about that protectionism of that equity?
I think it all is part of the same experience. I mean, it all goes hand in hand. And obviously, you've got distinctive assets in terms of design, but then you've got also experiential ones. So we know with Milka, for example, that it's a very specific melt in the mouth experience. And with Cadbury, it's a very different one. And we have a completely different process when we make those different chocolates. And even from the ingredients that you source. So the fresh milk coming from different locations will impact the taste. The cocoa, we source our cocoa from a certain location because that gives continuity of taste. And that continuity is what helps us deliver the same quality. So it's really important, and we are continuously doing, you know, benchmarks to make sure these products are consistent. And it's actually interesting because sometimes something will happen, a small tweak will happen, and you'll get a call to say, you know, I tasted your chocolate the other day, and this something tastes off, and it would just have been a tiny thing. Maybe it's switch of, you know, a milk from one place to the next, but it can have a huge impact on the taste. So it's something that you really have to be super careful with, and of course do a lot of research if you are going to be changing things. So yeah, very interesting.
Yeah, and it's there's also these stories that are these equities, right? Like you mentioned Milka, which for those in the States that may not know Milka, it's a European chocolate brand. It's celebrating its 120th year this year, which we're very excited about. And all of the milk comes from cows that live in the Alps. So it makes a very special chocolate. And you can imagine from a supply chain perspective, that's quite complicated. But that's an element of the story that also has to be protected. So it does there are those tangibles and those intangibles. And after 120 years, you have a lot of them, I would imagine, as the equities grow over time.
Absolutely.
So obviously this idea is sort of keeping current and keeping a sort of foot into, you know, what you stand for. So having this enduring promise that you have, and then sort of navigating the emerging cultural trends. What are some of the current cultural trends that are happening that you're sort of working through at the moment? Anything from your side, Grania?
Well, do you know, probably there's in so many different areas. I mean, the world is changing so much, but I suppose one big area for us is that hospitality in its entirety is being reinvented. So, you know, you've seen huge shutdowns, you're seeing the face of the industry, that the hospitality industry is changing. You know, so many businesses are actually going out of business. Their habits are changing. So, you know, this idea of drinking at home and cocktails at home and a whole new way of behaving, will they continue to go out in the same way? when everything comes back? Are we going to have another set of the roaring 20s where people like party like there is no tomorrow? So I think that is really understanding that from different levels, one from how consumers are going to behave as they emerge from this pandemic, but two, actually, how can we work with our customers as well, who've gone through, like, such a horrific time for most of them, and how do you support that? But at the same time, we're also looking at a shift into e-commerce that we have. It's been so interesting to watch, that idea that decades happen in weeks. The growth of alcohol online in the US over, March, April, May in 2020 has transformed behavior, and that behavior will stick around. So we're really grappling with kind of new ways to do business, and just that are changing really fast. So actually being prepared to try some things. Does that work? Does this work? No, let's do something else. I mean, there's a long list, but that's probably the one that's most topical for us.
Good, thanks. Obviously, you and I will be going back out and having drinks and helping the hospitality world.
Definitely.
So let's not worry about that. Anything, Kara, from your side, what are some of the currents of change that you guys are facing at the moment?
Well, it's interesting that 2020 being the year that it was, that in food and bev, at least, people turned back to heritage brands in many ways. So that's on the positive side. On the opposite side, speaking more broadly in macro, you saw heritage brands some heritage brands sort of face a reckoning with this more enlightened environment we're living in. I followed closely the companies who have brand icons that have been called out for being culturally insensitive or promoting racial stereotypes. And it's just a reminder of how our brands hold so much meaning, some very positive and nostalgic, and some very negative. And it's just been interesting to watch and think about how, as creatives and marketers, we can get ahead of that and address that. We're really the stewards of those brands. So again, it's just an interesting time in the world, and a time where design can have a lot of positive influence. So
yeah, it's so true. We always sometimes tend to think of tradition and history as a great thing to have as a brand, but it can also be baggage, and there can be things that you're not proud of, or practices or behaviors, or I don't know, if you're a new Coke, maybe you weren't so happy about that launch. So there are some things, but it's about sort of pushing through that. Susan, I know you've been working in some territories with some heritage brands. Any perspective from you on this?
Yeah, one actually came to mind is just in hearing everyone else talk and thinking about some of the recent work that we've been doing. One comes to mind just within the fiber supplement category. So, traditionally, it was, known for very functional in terms of just the regularity aspect of the fiber supplement category. And that's not anything that's certainly lost on this crew, but we really spent some time taking a look at really who is the right target audience, and really doubling down on a very specific target audience and being very crystal clear about that. And then actually thinking a little bit more about how do we elevate the benefit of this brand into a space that can feel more higher level, a little bit more emotive, a little broader, a little more holistic, out of just regularity. And so looking at it more from just the overall health benefit, healthy lifestyle, really seemed to be more applicable to sort of, folks are certainly thinking about health these days, right? And sort of what are the various ways by which brands can kind of step into that conversation. And this brand certainly had an opportunity to do that in a pretty meaningful way, given the focus on health, but also taking the time to really look at their brand foundation and think, who are we? What do we have the right to speak to? Kara, great point about sort of like, where can you use your brand voice? What's meaningful? What does that look like? And really having success in elevating that story into a higher level space.
Yeah, thanks, Susan. I mean, it's always, like our constant job is sort of grappling with the future and the current at the same time. And so these cultural currents are always going to come and sort of smack us in the face, if you will. I've always sort of talked about brand equity it is brand love, but there's also this idea that it's a brand you'd be willing to forgive when they mess up. Like, that's true love, when they mess up and you're kind of like, I still love you. there's a few brands in my world that are like that. I guess, Michael, just on that point, do you think that there is a sense of freedom with a heritage brand, that consumers maybe are more willing to forgive mistakes, or do you think the stakes are higher?
I do think, like was said previously, that in most cases the stakes are higher. If only, starting from a financial point of view, because these brands are often built and they are significant assets in and of themselves and through their company. But I guess where there is certainly strength, or maybe some latitude, is because of the recognition, because of the history, whether it's forgiveness or just if I try something and it's not perfect. Oftentimes in these big heritage brands, there's kind of a home base, right? There's your classic Milka bar, there's your classic roast of Folgers coffee. And so if I tried something that seemed a little bit new and interesting and it wasn't right for me, I kind of can go back to home base as a consumer and probably still feel really good about it. And I might say, hey, the brand wasn't perfect, but maybe it just wasn't right for me. And so hopefully there's a little bit of that interplay versus a new brand. I think you try it, it's not right, it might immediately kind of go into the out of your consideration set, maybe forever. And I think these heritage brands are brands that you have a familiarity with and some fluency with. They're going to stay in your consideration set longer. And I think that's where you want to try to balance, like, where do we stretch, where do we experiment, and where do we what's part of the brand or even part of your architecture that you hold sacred and is not to be touched or experimented with. And so I think you can try to use that, opportunistically or a little bit offensively to stretch with intention behind it.
Yep, makes sense. I mean, I like that idea of sort of a home base, that comfort. It's like, I've certainly tried a few, new drinks and gone, going back to the Manhattan. So you just go back to what you know and what you love. But also, I would imagine it's as a marketeer working on these brands, it's quite hard to defend that home base. There might be people internally, there might be cost sort of pressures that are happening in your supply chain. Bryony, maybe I'll come to you. How do you, maybe within your organization, just sort of defend that home base? How do you make sure that you're able to sort of keep that home base as strong as it has been?
I think in our organization, it's quite easy because the brands are so trusted and they've been around for such a long time that actually to do any kind of change, if we're trying to improve, we'll have to make sure that we really are improving it. It's significantly better. There are proper statistics behind those changes. Otherwise people do not want to touch it, and there's a sacred recipe, and no one knows exactly how to make it. So it's held. It's a very precious thing for us. And I think what's interesting is the leeway you have around product versus communication, because I think if you do something in the complete wrong tone, if you take offense with your communication, that's almost more dangerous than if you do an NPD that not everybody loves, because as you were saying, you might just say, well, it's not for me, but actually my younger cousin loves it. So I think it's the communication, the tone, that you can get very wrong. And that's also something to just bear in mind around, how far do you go with these experiments?
Yeah, that's interesting. Grania, do you have the same feeling of William Grant & Sons in terms of defending home? Is that easy?
Well, I think for us it is. We don't have the same issue as in, well, as we plan it, it's so far out, and there's such a, we have a very specific, this is Glenfiddich whiskey and this is what it tastes like. But I think probably in previous life and previous roles, I've really seen the sort of how far a brand can go before, like when it makes a mistake, if it potentially handles it right. So I was involved in the relaunch of Robinson's Fruit Shoot, which is a children's drink in the UK, actually globally, but for those in the US who don't know it. And there was a technical fault, there was a safety issue with the whole redesign and had to be recalled, pulled off shelves in supermarkets. A huge issue. So because it was a child safety issue. But interestingly, because it was pulled straight away, although the company lost money and the retailers and consumers were really willing to support the comeback because the mistake had been handled really well. So everyone went, okay, actually, people make mistakes. Everyone can see that, but you did it in the right way. And actually, you know, the brand, well, obviously there was huge financial challenges of the period. The brand came back, it regained distribution, it had that support. So I think, you know, you can make mistakes, but oftentimes it's how do you handle the mistake? As they say, the cover up is always worse than the lie in the first place.
Absolutely. Very true for what's happening this week in the news, isn't it? Kara, in your role from sort of a Vis ID or equity standpoint, do you have any stories or examples of maybe where there's been a debate about a level of change or wanting to sort of evolve a core equity, and how's that gone for you?
Yeah, and I don't know if this is a relevant example, but just to demonstrate how near and dear people hold certain equities to their heart. We recently evolved our corporate identity. So the J.M. Smucker Co. house of now over 40 brands, that's only happened really in the last 20 years. So for 100 years, we were all about jams and jellies and the Smucker's brand. So when we made that change, saw some uptick on social media with consumers thinking we changed our beloved Smucker's jam and jelly jar. And you know, a reaction of like, why would you do that? How could you, go so modern with those equities? They misunderstood that it was a corporate identity change. So again, it's just a reflection and a reinforcement that these brand codes, these brand equities, we have to be so thoughtful with and use communication, use all the tools in the marketing toolkit to make aware any type of change to any of our iconic brands. So in this case, it was good news because it was really a corporate ID project, but a good cautionary tale as you move too far on something that is, again, so nostalgic and iconic.
Yeah, no, thanks, Kara. It's a great example. And I guess, you know, as you think about either innovating new products or changing your Vis ID to make things more resonant with the zeitgeist of today, there's this tension that happens with the comfort that consumers have with where you are, but our future forward needs to sort of make sure that the brand is progressing. And so, you know, obviously we as marketeers still check in with consumers, but how do you take feedback from consumers when maybe they're not quite ready, or they're warning you that it's too early? So how would you sort of navigate? Maybe I'll come to you, Brian, because we do a lot of consumer work together. What's your sort of perspective on how the consumer plays into this sort of comfort versus revolution, or not revolution, but evolution of a brand?
I think it's a tricky one because, as you say, sometimes the consumer can only tell you what they know, right? So they know what exists today and they don't see the whole picture around how something might evolve. But I think still, there will be key signs that come if they say, this is not resonating. So to really try and understand what's driving it, and then to look at the whole picture. How is it looking within your hand? How's it making you feel? How are those iconic assets working? How does it work within the whole brand architecture? So trying to have a look at sort of the whole picture, and then making sure small things, if you're iterating, just quickly take it and put it on the shelf and see how it looks, because suddenly when it's in the shelf in the store lighting, it's got a completely different feel about it. So I think it's it's a challenge. It's an exciting challenge when you are trying to navigate, and we do see that I think you also have to ask the right consumers. You have to ask some that have a bit more of a vision, or a little bit more open to change. Try and get it right, try and get it to that destination, and then obviously do the final checks.
Yeah, I was having a conversation with someone recently too about sort of this quant, and we're talking about sort of the beauty of qualitative is obviously that it's not just what people say, but it's how they say it. So if they're sitting up in their chair excited about something versus, yeah, I give it a 7 out of 10. There's an energy level that you can extract as well versus just a reaction to an idea, and if that's really supporting your goal and your ambition.
Yeah. And so I don't think you can sort of you need to apply. That's why I talk about the emotion. You need to apply. It's all about creativity and bringing that creativity to life. And then I think it's also allowing the team a bit of space to craft that design, to push it to the next level, to live with it, to sit with it. So allowing space in the creative process, allowing feedback, but then also, you know, having a clear idea around the brief that you have and the boundaries you're willing to play within, I think is also helpful, because what the risk that you also have is, you know, you ask too many people, too many cooks in the kitchen, you can also lose your way. So I think it's about trying to find the balance, but having a clear brief where you want to get to, what you want to stand for, having people around the table, looking at them, watching them interact, talking about maybe creative territories, brand worlds, as opposed to specific designs, will then help you kind of lead you to your destination, rather than asking people to comment on pure execution.
Yeah, absolutely. Really getting to the crux of the idea and the motivation, and because we can fix an execution, can't we?
We can,
yeah,
and we do.
Yeah, exactly. We do, exactly. Just a reminder, we've got about a few more minutes before I'll start taking questions. So if people do have questions, please drop them into the chat box. I wanted to ask a question around maybe potential pitfalls. So if you were hiring someone to, let's say you're moving on to your next great role, and someone's coming after you to take over, and they're sort of, we're giving them the keys to these heritage brands. Maybe Grania, I'll start with you. What would be a couple of pieces of advice of pitfalls to avoid, of things, maybe mistakes or things that maybe you haven't done wrong, but you thought about maybe?
Oh, it's an interesting one. I think actually what I would say is, genuinely, don't be too scared. It's easy to have, you know, to be like, oh, but I don't think people would want to change that, and to sort of make some big assumptions about, you know, this is the way that it is. But actually, it's really surprising, even in what many people consider a traditional industry, like Scotch whiskey, actually people are super excited to try things and do new things, and there's a whole different world out there. So I think for me, it's, you know, don't be, yeah, my big piece of advice would be don't be scared.
Awesome. Kara, what about you?
I would echo what Grania mentioned. I think on the design side too, it's having a bit of creative bravery, and you almost have to push it too far. I mean, Bryony spoke to that. Push it too far to know where your sandbox is. Don't be afraid. It's tough. It's easier said than done when you're talking about billion-dollar brands that there's, you know, big stakes. But I think staying true back to what is the success criteria? You know, what is the brief? What is the strategy? If you can stay true to that purpose and that strategy, you know, a lot of these brand stewards kind of know best with consultancy from consumers on where to take the brand back to the big picture, not just the marketing component, not just the design component. It's all things tied together. So that would be the advice, or I guess the question was pitfall, but that's the advice. Push it.
Yeah. Advice, things, yeah, to not be scared of. Brian, anything to add from your perspective?
I think focus, because there are focus on the big things that mean something, and things that you can shift and that are the most important, because there are so many distractions along the way. And I think businesses can also get very excited by innovation, especially the sales team. You know, it's easy to sell an innovation, whereas, you know, to really drive your core business, your core brand, to make that exciting, to build that up, it's not always as easy as, or it doesn't seem as easy as the shiny new innovation, which is not necessarily, you know, it will take a lot of work, but it's not necessarily going to build the same kind of long-term growth that you need. So I think that would be my advice around, just stick with the focus on important things.
That's actually a great segue to another question I had, Bryony, because I was going to ask, do you think, you know, all brands should have a pretty solid innovation strategy, right? Everybody should have down on a page how innovation can support their higher level ambitions and jobs to be done and goals. Do you think that heritage brands have a different innovation strategy? Should they have a different innovation strategy?
To start,
I'll throw that back at you. Yeah, to start to a newer brand. Yeah.
I mean, I think an innovation strategy is very specific to the category or the brand that you're working on, and each one is going to look different, and there's going to be different jobs to be done. But I think, you know, planning and building a brand long term, you need a brand strategy, you need an innovation strategy, you need a brand purpose. So I think absolutely yes.
Yeah, great. A couple last questions for me is, have you seen any examples of a heritage brand, whether it's something in your category or outside, that you thought recently, oh my gosh, that was so breakthrough. Like, I did not expect that to happen from X brand. I mean, I think, Grania, at the top of the hour, you mentioned Gucci and Harry Styles, which absolutely. Anybody have any other examples that come to mind? It's a bit of a tough one on the spot.
I have one from L'Oreal. Actually, I spoke about them being very innovative, and I think I'm not sure if it's actually been released, but I saw a while ago an article about something that they've developed called Perso, which is it's a dispenser. It's basically a smart dispenser which will match different foundations and skincare according to your own skin type, which I think is amazing, because obviously one of the insights would be a lot of people don't know can't match the right skin creams, etc., for their own skin. So this takes that out, and then it will actually make it for you on the spot, which I think is amazing.
That is spectacular. I'll have to go try that out. Great.
Amy, I was just going to add more from like a communications piece, but I actually thought the Jeep ad with Bruce Springsteen, it was a Super Bowl ad this year in the US. Controversial, I think polarizing. For me, I thought it really landed. I thought it was a smart way to connect kind of the heritage of the brand with, issues and kind of cultural changes that are happening, very much of the moment in our country. So to me, that was effective at taking a brand that, maybe kind of ebbs and flows out of the cultural conversation and putting it smack dab in the middle. And at least, I think everybody almost that saw it probably had a strong opinion one way or the other.
Yeah, great. I'll add one that I saw that just because as an American living in England, I don't understand this beans on toast phenomenon, but yet it exists. And the if you haven't seen it, there's a good Twitter debate around beans on Weetabix, and just how the brands got involved in this debate was absolutely spectacular. And I mean, it was such a, it's easy on Twitter, right? It's tweets, but it was so powerful and reached a lot of great people, and really enjoyed that. I think we've got a few questions. Susan, are you good to sort of facilitate that for us?
Sure, absolutely. Thanks for all the questions in the chat. We appreciate that. It's definitely an invigorating conversation. So appreciate all of the fodder and thoughts that folks are throwing in here. I think we've got time for maybe one or two, and then Michael, I'll throw it your way so that you can help wrap us up. But I see that there's a question in the chat from Emily. And just poking a little bit further on just the holistic perspective and making sure that these heritage brands, like how those come together with a more holistic perspective, and how we found ways to actually match that up with consumer expectations. And it's a little tricky for sure. So it's a good question. I really think this comes back, and I'll throw in some thoughts here. And if there's others that have thoughts on this too, please, by all means. But I really feel like in the case of the brands I've worked on where we've had success in doing this, it really comes back to really truly understanding who you are and what the brand truly stands for, what that promise is, and what consumers are expecting. And then being able to extend that out in meaningful ways. And that might mean like being very choiceful about where you show up, how you show up, which channels you show up in, which ones you're actually choosing to pull back from, because you simply are just at that point, really haven't earned the right to be in that space, and consumers aren't expecting that. But they are paying attention to the ones that you do have the right to play in. And so I think it's about really making choiceful decisions that are anchored in the strategy of the brand, that has really enabled us to be able to make some smart choices and been able to evolve these heritage brands into a space that still maintains the nostalgia and what people love about that, but also in a way that just feels relevant and current.
Yeah, it definitely goes back to that focus that you were talking about, Brian, of like not getting distracted by all this stuff on the sides, which is hard to do. Does anybody have any tips about how to not get distracted? Or Grania, do you have something to add?
Well, I don't know about not getting distracted, but I think what's quite interesting, and just to pick up what you said, Susan, you can talk to different consumers in different ways, and it's not because of the sort of fragmentation of all the channels now, people don't see everything that somebody else that you do. So actually you can be really selective. So a great example was Dior using Pokemon when they did their Dior Air collaboration. Now, unless you were actually using Pokemon, you would not have known about that. So, you know, their more traditional Dior customer just never saw it, never knew about it, but they were bringing in a whole new group of people with that activity. So I think there are ways to be selective about your audience and spaces that you can try new things and be brave while keeping that like total story working.
Amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we have time for maybe one more question, and then we'll wrap this up. So there is a question in the chat that is, how do you determine who of your consumers are open to change? Are there stages in life that you look for, or demographics or major societal events, something else that becomes some of those trigger points for what people are actually interested in hearing about, or where you feel like there's opportunity to involve that space?
I can throw a thought out, and then
yeah, Amy, yeah, great.
Yeah, I'll throw a thought out. We recently did a large piece of work on some innovation strategy for a large drinks business, and when we got the results back, we essentially decided to look at Gen X and Gen Z as a proxy for openness, not necessarily as a target audience, but as a proxy for sort of future potential. And then we thought about really firming up the idea with the target consumer. So I think, at least in my perspective, from an innovation perspective, I think it depends on the gate of what you're trying to learn, because and what the sort of stimulus is in terms of engaging with those consumers. And obviously every category is going to be different, because that was in the drinks business. So those different generations made sense. But yeah, that's just what I would throw out there.
Yeah. Very cool. All right, Michael, want to take us home?
Sure thing. So, you know, one, great conversation. Thank you to everybody that was on the panel, particularly our guests. You know, really lively, I think informative. I certainly, you know, continues to expand the way that I understand, you know, these challenges that brands face in different categories in different ways. In advance of knowing this panel was happening, you know, we've been having kind of in these conversations. I mean, one, it happens all the time, kind of in the business, distributed to our teams, but you know, we got a lot of our kind of leaders at LPK together, you know, in different forums, and discussing like, how can heritage brands evolve, flex, thrive going forward? And you know, we kind of gathered some themes at a high level. I think many of them, obviously, we've kind of heard today coming from the panel, but you know, just to kind of share some of these as parting thoughts of what the, you know, these challenges that brands are forever going to face. How do we, what's the response, right? Like, we know these challenges are out there, so how do we respond? You know, the first one is just this reminder to ourselves, and again, heard this from each of you, that heritage brands, you know, this kind of heritage really should embolden a brand and not hold it back. So there's the reality that if your brand has endured for decades, maybe centuries, that it was probably built on something really strong, or in most cases. And so the challenge is go back, identify that core human truth, that original insight that probably inspired the brand's original, you know, its origin, and find that and bring that forward with strategies that are going to resonate today in more of the emergent culture. But go back to that original truth. Like, that's you know, that is home base. That's the thing that should be kind of prized and elevated continually. Secondly, I know Kara did a great job talking about this and how they think about it at Smucker's. You know, understanding what are your most distinctive assets, what should be revered, and also what has the permission to be evolved. And oftentimes, both of those things can be true. We can revere and prize an asset, but also evolve it. Like, it's almost what we owe to the asset, to the distinctive brand asset, is to continue to nurture it and bring it along and make it relevant for today. So, you know, one of the things that we counsel our brands to do is to commit to regular health checks. Track your equity, evaluate the quality of your core assets, gauge how distinctive they really are. Sometimes you might find this with your teammates or with clients you work with, because you're so close to it, you might be thinking some things are untouchable that actually aren't. So learn, get those in front of consumers, do the learning, and then look for ways to modernize. Third one we would say is, progress your voice, make it fit with the time. So there is a kind of, phenomenon that we see where voices are trusted, but they can also get a little bit boring. So draw on that rich history, progress your voice, make the messaging feel relevant and authentic for the times. And that's a way we were talking about how to connect to new audiences. Using a voice that sounds both true to the brand, but also of today is a way to connect to new audiences. And then, double down on that promise, as Susan was alluding to, and make it relevant across channels. So the Dior example that was just shared, perfect example of making that work in a particular channel, in a particular activation. So you can be selective about the audience, but also heritage brands, any brands, don't need to be everywhere. So be thoughtful, be selective about where to show up. And then finally, at times to grow, you really just need to kind of loosen the grip on things and get stretching. And that's obviously the role that innovation can play. And I thought, some of the examples that both Grania and Bryony were sharing, it's like, you don't have to be scared. You can be really thoughtful about what's adding value, but also have the courage to move away from things that aren't working and to try new things and to be experimental, even if you're making 12-year-old scotch. So I found that really inspiring, that there is permission to evolve and grow and change. And then our last little plug, and I'll throw it back to Amy, is at LPK, we've created this a tool to, or a canvas to really assess the state of your heritage brand and think about the path forward. So I think for everybody that's on this particular roundtable, we'll be following up with an email, and you can expect a link to be able to download the canvas in that email.
Thank you, Michael. We are right on time. So I just want to really thank everyone for joining today. Bryony, Kara, Grania, loved chatting with you guys in a non-work situation, although it was about work, but really enjoyed the conversation. Thanks for joining. We have more roundtables coming this summer, so please do look on lpk.com. And any questions, or if you want to keep the conversation going, by all means, you know where to find us. Thanks so much, guys.
Thanks, Amy.
Thanks, Amy.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.